Hi, I'm Steve Morgan, founder of Cybersecurity Ventures and editor-in-chief at Cybercrime magazine. I'm here today with Christy Wyatt, president and CEO at Absolute, the company behind the world's only undeletable endpoint resilience platform. Absolute has over 13,000 global customers, and their agent is embedded in over 500 million endpoints. Welcome, Christy. It's great to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to jump right in and ask you about Absolute's 2020, the State of Endpoint Resilient report. It's really one of the best reports that our editors have received, and we get a lot from the vendor community. It's a fantastic report. Give CSOs and security leaders a 30,000-foot view of the report.
Well, first of all, thank you for the feedback. I think what we try to demonstrate is what I call sort of the false sense of security. So I think as an industry, we're very good at understanding risk, understanding controls that would mitigate that risk. What we have less visibility into is how effective are those controls working. And so that's really what we try to focus on, given our unique position in the hardware, looking up at the software stack. We try to really sort of shed a light on what's working and what's not working so that organizations know where to focus their efforts.
So talking about a false sense of security, after reading the report, I think I had one. There was one thing that really jumped out at me. 60% of breaches can be linked to a vulnerability where a patch was available but not applied. I had to go back and read that a couple more times to make sure I was getting it right. To be in 2020 after so many years of discussing this over and over again, is that the reality of where we are?
It really is, and I think if you really try to unpack that a little bit, it's probably less shocking if you understand. And I think also in the report we report out how many security controls are living on any given endpoint, and I think the average is more than 10. Although if you talk to any sizable enterprise organization, they'll tell you that the number is probably closer to 20 plus in terms of security applications and controls that they're managing on that device. And so each one of those controls and each one of those vendors is actively looking for vulnerabilities or new risks and actively updating their software. And you just end up with this very complex, tangled stack of technology. And so sometimes those things conflict with one another. Sometimes the user was tinkering with them. Other times IT is holding back on pushing updates out, especially when users are remote and they can't get their hands on the keyboard if something goes wrong. There's a whole host of reasons why these patches aren't being applied, but in general, right, there is a fair number of devices that are sitting out of compliance that we just don't see.
So, Christy, the COVID-19 pandemic has led to an enormous new remote workforce for organizations globally, and this has dramatically expanded the attack surface. What does the Absolute report say, if anything, about the risk to sensitive data in light of this new world we're working in?
So I think that there's a couple of different things. First is organizations are, especially in the beginning of the working from home, they were reluctant to push out a lot of new technology. So things like updates and upgrades were even compounding because you wouldn't want to push out a bunch of new technology to devices that you couldn't get your hands on the keyboard to fix if something went wrong. The second thing that we see is that the amount of personal identifiable information and sensitive information is actually piling up on these devices. And there's some human behavior factors to that. One is people are concerned about the level of connectivity that they're going to have. And so they take a lot of data home with them. They decide that they may not be able to rely on the connection, so they stockpile it. So a lot of our technology will go out and sort of scan for that data and then maybe encrypt it and leave it protected in the meantime. So the second part I'd say is that it is leveling out as people became more comfortable with working from home and this transition. I think that they learned a new set of skills, and so we're seeing that start to level out now.
So the Absolute report talks about application resilience, which Absolute defines as the health of endpoint security controls, as well as their ability to react to collision or damage. And this is unique in the way that Absolute describes it, not something the industry has really heard before, not in those words. Can you explain?
Yeah, absolutely. So endpoint resilience in our mind is really an acknowledgement that this complexity is not going to go away. As I said, devices may have 10 plus security controls. They may be interfering with one another. They may be in various different states of connectivity to the network. And so compliance kind of wavers. And we don't believe that you can make, we don't believe that the industry is doing a bad job of delivering security controls. We think they're doing a great job, but it is impossible to test for the infinite number of combinations of things that you're going to have to coexist with. And so endpoint resilience is really the concept that devices need to have some level of self-awareness, for lack of a better term, where they can actually monitor themselves. They can see when these controls are going offline, and they can heal themselves. And so there's a lot of implications behind that. We think that it's rooted in persistence, the ability to survive. If you're one of the 10 plus security applications running on an operating system, you are one of the things that is going to go dark once in a while, no fault of your own. And so the ability to have some permanent connection to the device, the ability to monitor and see when things are going offline, and then be able to take action in an automated way. So one thing we've all seen across the industry is that it has gotten increasingly hard for IT organizations to respond to the number of help desk calls and alerts that they're getting. And that just becomes even more compounded when everybody goes home. I think this entry into work from home really brought help desks to their knees in many organizations. VPN was a great example. One of our first responses during the pandemic was actually because so many customers were actually telling their employees to turn off their VPN. A lot of their security applications relied on devices sitting on the corporate network in order to work. They were listening and watching local area traffic. But because VPN was not staying up, they hadn't really designed the capacity for the amount that they were going to see. They didn't have the reliability, and they didn't have some way to self-heal or remediate that risk. They just asked employees to turn it off at the worst possible moment, right? So we just talked about employees are taking more data home. They're harder to support. Devices are becoming out of compliance, and we're turning off some of the very controls that are meant to protect them, because they were never designed for sort of that scale within that particular organization. And so endpoint resilience was really around building the capability to help manage and be a productive part of that into the endpoint itself with our OEM partners.
Wow, turn off your VPN. Scary.
Yeah, wasn't a big moment.
So your report was possible in part because of your digital footprint. I had, really no sense of how pervasive Absolute was, just how many devices that you're monitoring. In the report I read, it was 8.5 million devices. Is that right?
We currently have over almost 9.5 million devices active, and a very large number of those were factored into the report.
Right. And most of those are running Windows. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
Now, over what period of time did those devices, get managed by Absolute? Over how many years?
We've been embedded in these devices for almost 2 decades, and so on the report, as well as we have a couple of live dashboards we update weekly on our website, one for enterprise and one for education. We try to show the incremental change in sort of what we're seeing. In the endpoint report that we're talking about, it was since last year. So we were really looking at the delta between sort of same time last year and the behavior we're seeing. But in some of our other research, we actually publish what we call pre-COVID and post-COVID. So there's a very distinct period of time, even within that 12 months, that's kind of before and after November, where you can see a marked change both in how frequently devices are used, how many devices fall under heavy usage by our definition, some of the things we've already talked about in terms of their number of days outstanding till they get an update, the number of controls, etc. So we try to keep it sort of a running trend so you can see how things are changing.
Right. So I'm curious what the CISO reaction is to the report. I'm sure you speak to a lot of them. For instance, 90% of enterprise Windows 10 devices are missing critical security updates, according to the report. What kind of feedback are you getting?
I don't think we're seeing anything shocking to folks who are living in a day-to-day world. I think that one of our advisors was head of security for one of the world's largest banks for a very long period of time, and he would say that when something goes wrong, you ask 3 questions. what was the risk? What control did we have that would remediate that risk? And was it working? And we really kind of, answered that third piece, which is a really, really hard problem to solve. So I think our response to the data, there's some alarm because I think people who are not as close to the issue tend to have more of that false sense of security and say, well, wait a minute, in the board meeting, we talked about, do we have controls for some of these items? And you told us yes. So why would we be vulnerable? Making a trip over the word operationalization of security, how we actually execute against our security strategies is much, much harder to measure. And the efficacy of security is much, much harder to measure. So I think that the ability to quantify it has been a bit of a surprise. The gap is bigger than many folks thought, but also, I think there's a lot more interest in this concept of self-healing. We've seen the term self-healing, not just our version of it, really become a much broader term, not just for ourselves, but for a number of other vendors or analysts across the industry. There's an acknowledgement that endpoint resilience is a real capability, and it's something that's measurable and valuable to every enterprise.
So Absolute says that endpoint resilience requires an unbreakable connection. What exactly do you mean by that?
So we have a very unique piece of technology that has been built into the non-flashable part of the BIOS for almost 20 years for 26 plus OEM manufacturers. So some of our best partners are names like Dell, Lenovo, HP, Microsoft. I mean, there's a very long list. And so what that means is that these devices, that tiny piece of code on its own does very little, but when you activate a license of Absolute's enterprise software, it sort of pairs with the hardware itself. And so from that point on, we can survive almost any event that happens to that device. If you reflash the operating system, almost every other security control you would have installed on it would disappear as a reinstall, but we would survive that because the device would wake up and say, wait a minute, something's not right, and it would heal itself. On the specific controls, we can extend that concept of self-healing, not just for our own software, but for any one of those security applications we just talked about. So when we talk about self-healing, the self-healing ecosystem, we have about 40 security applications today. It's really the sort of the leading names in security that our customers have the ability to make undeletable, that can survive those events that happen to that device. So we make those applications stickier. We can take the resiliency of an application from something like 72% up to 97, 98, 99%, meaning it's going to be there when you need it.
So we're talking about CSOs and security teams and, how they react to some of this data. Maybe, we're surprised by it. They're not. I'm curious, to your own, reaction to some of the facts and figures that are in the report. You're a global cybersecurity CEO. You've been in the business for a while. Absolute features one of our statistics in the report. Cybercrime damages will reach $6 trillion next year. That's about 3 times what it was in 2015. Does that surprise you? Things are getting worse, not better. We can't completely get our arms around this.
It doesn't surprise me because if you look at the global spend on cybersecurity, it's more than doubled in the last 10 years. And so if you talk to anyone, who's on the buying side of this, they will tell you that every year they are acquiring more and more critical controls. And so that's going to increase the complexity. I think that we're approaching a moment, and the reason why we believe this is a very timely conversation is because this is a really critical moment for everybody to sort of hit the pause button and say, before we go focus on the next scary way that someone could compromise us, let's make sure the investments we've already made are actually working. If I'm losing 20 to 30 cents on every dollar of the billions and billions that we're spending on security as an industry, then we're not doing it right. And so we need a better way of making sure that the things that we're purchasing are actually working. So I don't know that there was a lot of surprise because we've seen that spend go up. We've seen the number of vendors in the industry increase. We've seen that cycle accelerate. I think within large organizations, they used to view acquiring a software capability, they would capitalize it over a long period of time. Today, it maybe has a shelf life of 12 to 18 months. So I think the trends add up. What we never really had was a way of quantifying the fragmentation, right? Really trying to understand, because you look at a high level and you see things like, market share reports in any particular category, and I don't care whether it's, VPN or antivirus or malware detection or whatever it is, identity and access management. It looks like a finite number of vendors, and you think, that there's some conformity or some consistency. When you start to apply the infinite number of combinations of OS patches and application patches and network configurations and mobility and, were they connected or not connected? Did the transmission get interrupted? You start to understand the complexity, and then it becomes very, very clear.
You've mentioned complexity a few times, and, you play in a space where, it's probably the most difficult for the security practitioners. And the report says that the endpoint complexity in of itself is a vulnerability just because there's so much there. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I think that, if you were sitting in the IT operations or the security operations team of any one of these sizable organizations, you see it really clearly, right? You have a backlog of, our research would say, 100 applications within a standard organization, 10 plus security applications within that. And so, it becomes very clear, each one of those with their own roadmap, their own patch schedule. You have your own programs going on within your organization, infrastructure upgrades, employee movements, M&A, consolidations, spin out. I mean, it's a never ending target. So you have this moving landscape of assets, which on its own is very difficult to track if you don't have that permanent connection to each of these devices. And then add on top of that, right, the different layers of technology. And then the final, I would say, element of complexity is always the user. I mean, every one of us has been sitting on a laptop that has gotten slower and slower and slower and said, what has IT got on here that's slowing me down, and goes in and starts to tinker with things or go on a network or figure out some other non-conformant way of operating within that device. And that just becomes yet another anomaly that IT and operations teams have to plan around.
So I want to ask you about another challenge for our community, and we're going to kind of move off technology. It has to do with labor. We're in the midst of a labor crunch. You in particular have been singled out as a top woman, not only in security, but in technology. You've been singled out by Inc. magazine and a number of other publications. According to our last figures, about 20% of cybersecurity positions globally are held by women. That's up from about 11 or 12% 5 years ago. Are we making progress, Christy, from your vantage point? Are things getting any better?
I think we are making progress. Now ask me if I'm doing it fast enough, or if we're collectively doing it fast enough. I think that, we'd all love to see more and faster. I think that the opportunities are definitely there. And I like to look at the number of emerging women leaders across the cybersecurity industry, both on the IT side as well as on the vendor and research side. There's a healthy emerging sort of cohort of these just amazing women that are sort of coming up. And I think that that's the start, right? The expression is you need to see it to be it. And so I think if you're a young woman is contemplating going into technology, or you're in technology and you're contemplating thinking in cybersecurity, you need to have those role models around you to know that this is a path that's sort of available to you, consciously or subconsciously. And so I think we're making progress, but of course I'm going to want more.
Right. Well, and I think especially in the leadership ranks, we put out an annual report about a month and a half ago. And we took a roll call. We went straight down the Fortune 500, and we listed each one of the CSOs, and then looked at gender. And we were surprised. 14% of the Fortune 500 CSOs are women. We thought the number would have been higher, more in line with the rest of positions.
I mean, I think whether we're talking about CISO, CIO, CTO, head of engineering, CFO, I mean, we have a consistent trend across the tops of many of these functions. I think that it really is reliant on us to kind of shine a light, show the path, help folks understand, help young women understand what the path looks like. Our CIO is a female leader, strong female leader, came out of financial services. Our head of security is actually a strong female leader inside of Absolute. So, we proactively try both within the community as well as within our own organization to try to provide those opportunities. And this is, in no way, shape, or form a hard thing to do. There are many, many, many talented women out there that can fill these roles.
So, Christy, before we let you go, do you have a message for the community, for CSOs, for security practitioners, for the people who you help? We're in a very uncertain time right now. Where do you see things going over the next year? Just anything you'd like to share.
I think as much as we've talked about the change in working from home and the impact of kind of the recent events, I don't think what we've really talked about is how fundamentally this actually shifts the landscape for enterprise computing. I don't think we've fully absorbed that yet. There are entire categories, it's my belief, entire categories of security technologies that were heavily network-based, that had some sort of assumption, if not dependence, on sitting on a corporate network, either directly or through a VPN. And I think that as much as we've talked about mobility and zero trust and new sort of networking models, the last couple of months have really been a forcing function for that. Not just in are we comfortable with people working remotely and can we be productive, but can we be safe, can we protect, and what opportunities does that open up for us as an industry? And within the cybersecurity space, I think that challenges a lot of our assumptions. I think that we're going into a new chapter, and that chapter has to assume that resiliency is a critical capability, agility is a critical capability, even if you think that you're headed back into the office, or that you have solidified your thinking around a hybrid model. Those assumptions are going to get challenged, and you may get asked to mobilize again on a moment's notice in one direction or another. And I think that's all sort of deeply embedded in how we make decisions now. We have to assume that you have the ability to control and manage, and that you have this permanency and this ability to function no matter where your people are and what we're going through. Because when you're not focusing on that operationally, you have the ability to focus on running your business. And we all know that no matter what business you're in, you had a lot of bigger things to think about over the past couple of months. So I think we're just starting to understand the long-term impact of what we're going through.
Right. Well, Christy, great report. Just quickly, where can people get the report? Is it on your homepage?
It's on our homepage at absolute.com. The Endpoint Trends report is there, and our live dashboards are there, where you can also see week by week what's happening as people progress through the next couple of months.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today, Christy.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm Steve Morgan, founder of Cybersecurity Ventures and editor-in-chief at Cybercrime Magazine. Visit us on the web at cybercrimemagazine.com. Joining us today was Christy Wyatt, President and CEO at Absolute, the world's only undeletable endpoint resilience platform. To learn more about our sponsor, visit absolute.com.